This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Over the weekend, Poland and Hungary announced that they would be, at least temporarily, banning the import of grain and other foodstuffs from Ukraine. The EU agreed to lift all tariffs and quotas on Ukrainian imports back in May of last year, when Ukraine was struggling to export via the Black Sea. And while the measures provide Ukraine with a large export market and a much-needed source of foreign currency, cheap Ukrainian grain has undercut farmers in Central and Eastern Europe, who have been pushing for a U-turn since the beginning of the year. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well in the EU, not least because it puts even more strain on the Ukrainian economy, but also because customs are supposed to be decided by the EU at the supranational level, not by member states. So in this video, we're going to look at what's happened, why it's provoked such anger in Brussels, and what all this says about Europe's attitude to Ukraine. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To understand this story, you need to know a bit about Ukraine's economy, and specifically its role as an agricultural exporter. As we've detailed in previous videos, Ukraine is an agricultural export powerhouse, sometimes known as the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine has the most arable land in all of Europe, excluding Russia, and before the war, Ukraine's food exports provided the calories to feed about 400 million people. Ukraine accounted for something like 10% of the world's wheat exports, 16% of its maize, and roughly 50% of its sunflower oil. Now, if you looked at a map, you might assume that Ukraine used to export most of its produce to Europe. After all, Ukraine borders 4 EU member states, and has pretty good rail and road connections to its European neighbours. However, in part because of the EU's protective agricultural policies, Ukraine actually exports a lot of its produce to North Africa via the Black Sea, and especially Odessa, which is usually responsible for about 98% of Ukrainian wheat exports. This is why Putin's invasion was terrible news for Ukraine's farming industry. Ukrainian farmers actually did amazingly well last year. Despite a literal war in the country, Ukrainian farmers harvested 26.6 million tons of wheat in 2022 and successfully planted 80% of 2023's harvest, with most of the losses coming from fields around the front lines in Donbass. For context, 26.6 million tonnes is down from 2021's record-breaking 33 million tonne harvest, but close to the 5-year average of 27.9 million. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it couldn't export most of this grain because the Russian Navy was blockading the Black Sea, and the Ukrainian army had mined most of Ukraine's Black Sea ports to prevent an amphibious Russian assault. The Ukrainians tried to shift export via other routes, including rail, road, and the Danube River. But export volumes were still down 75%, and by April, there was something like 20 million tonnes worth of produce just stuck in the country. Things were made slightly better by the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was brokered by Turkey and the UN, and allowed Ukraine to export some of its stuff through the Black Sea. But because every shipment had to be checked by Turkish authorities, only a few million tonnes of food was actually exported via the Black Sea. The high cost of shipping insurance reduced export volumes even further, and Ukrainian farmers were left sitting on millions of tonnes of foodstuffs during an international food crisis. This is why, in May, the EU announced that, in order to, quote, mitigate the negative economic impact of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and support the Ukrainian authorities, it would be removing all trade barriers on Ukrainian exports, allowing Ukrainian food to flow freely into the European single market. While this measure was originally supported by basically the entire EU, Ukraine's foodstuffs have undercut European producers, provoking outrage in Central and Eastern Europe. Not only does Ukraine produce a lot of food, but the weakness of the Ukrainian hryvnia against the euro means that it's cheaper than European produce. This means that European producers can't compete with Ukrainian producers, and even if they can sell their produce, the flood of Ukrainian foodstuffs has brought prices down across the board. This first became an issue in January, when, at an EU farm ministerial meeting in Brussels, agriculture ministers from 6 European countries, Poland, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia demanded limits on Ukrainian imports and compensation for affected farmers. In a joint position paper, the countries argued that, while they supported Ukraine in its fight against the Russian aggression, the dramatic rise in Ukrainian food imports, which are up by more than 10,000% year on year, have caused serious market disturbances. While they stopped short of calling for a reintroduction of tariffs, the countries involved asked for compensation for their agricultural sector and for the EU to actively redirect Ukrainian produce past Central Europe through to Western Europe. While the EU did dish out some compensation for the agricultural crisis reserve, this wasn't enough apparently. So last weekend, Poland and Hungary decided to take matters into their own hands and unilaterally limit imports of Ukrainian produce into their countries until the end of June. This came after both the Polish and Romanian agriculture ministers faced calls to resign, to which the Polish minister eventually succumbed, and it's probably not a coincidence that quite a few of these countries have elections coming up. Bulgaria is still yet to form a functioning government after its 5th election in 2 years, so we'll probably have another one sometime soon, while Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party are due to face the electorate later this year. Law and Justice won the 2019 election with strong support in rural areas, and they need farmers on their side to guarantee another majority. Anyway, this didn't go down too well with the European Commission, who stated on Sunday that trade policy is of EU exclusive competence, and therefore unilateral actions are not acceptable. Even though it looks like Kyiv were warned ahead of time, it's hard to imagine this went down well in Ukraine either. After all, agriculture now accounts for a majority of Ukraine's exports and represents a critical source of foreign currency. On top of that, Russia has recently expressed doubts about extending the Black Sea grain deal, which is scheduled to expire in the next couple of weeks and would further limit Ukraine's foreign currency inflows. This also doesn't bode well for Ukraine's prospects in the long term. If Central and Eastern Europe are unwilling to even let Ukraine sell its grain in Europe, it's hard to see them maintaining their ironclad support for Kyiv in a long war with Russia. And it's even harder to see them accepting Ukraine into the EU without a serious rewriting of the common agricultural policy to better protect their local agriculture industries. These are all clearly huge decisions, but one much smaller, easier decision you can make is improving your skills and career prospects with Brilliant.org. That's because while we all know that the promise of AI is that it'll make our lives easier, it's very possible it'll make our work lives more difficult, replacing some people and requiring different skills of others. Brilliant, however, is the best way of improving your STEM skills quickly and in a fun way, investing in your own human intelligence. That's because Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making and more, with new lessons added monthly. And by the way, these lessons are interactive and engaging, designed around principles of active learning, so there's no boring lectures here. That means that by investing a few minutes every day in lifelong learning, you can improve your skills and feel a real sense of accomplishment. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by clicking on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.